Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to take just a minute, let everybody get settled. As a reminder, if you could change your name to your actual name, that way I'll know who everybody is. It looks like we're in good shape this morning, and Dave's going to do some drawing for us today. So if you need to go grab a pencil and sketchbook or anything like that, take the time to do that now. And Jay, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. All right, thanks again. This lecture is technically called Design Classical Architecture. There's a lot of images to look through. This is kind of a different class of what I've done before, as we're going to be talking about, well, I'm not sure we'll have time to sit down and draw. There's about several projects to look at. But let me change the screen over to where you can see hold on just a minute. Okay, so I think you can see the first, can everybody see the first slide, Design Classical Architecture?
Yes.
Okay, so part of this is design, and that means we're going to be looking at several different architects and how they sort of borrowed from other design, I hate to say the word borrowed, but incorporated early sort of classical typology into their architectural language. The one is, we talked about the golden section, and technically this section is really proportion and geometry. We're going to see proportion, design, and geometry. There's some really wonderful projects that we probably haven't seen before. I'm just going to kind of read these. So the 5-column ratio proportion, I'll go that in just a minute on my drawing table. So again, we're going to be looking at themes and repetition. The Dictation Window, what is that? The Cerulean Arch, we've seen it before. The dome and pavilion relationship, how those related. Of course, proportion, we're going to revisit again, the regulating line and the golden section. These are some really wonderful projects designed by some architects really I haven't looked at. Anjat Gabriel, he's the one that the Gabriel Prize in Architecture is named after. There was an architect here that established the Gabriel Prize, which I was awarded in 2010 as a drawing, an architecture fellowship. His work, he pretty much was the architect for Louis XV's architecture project. So pretty much we're going to be looking at what's called small, medium, and large in the projects. I just have a list of each one of these. You can write these in your notebook for just a minute. We're going to be looking at 2 extraordinary buildings by my favorite neoclassical firm, McKinney and White. They did outstanding work, roughly right before the Industrial Revolution. They're using this incredibly wonderful language of classical architecture. So we're going to look at it as a small scale, the Petit Trianon, the Little Pavilion, a larger building, Place de la Concorde in Paris, then larger and an extra large Manhattan Municipal Building. These are just extraordinarily large buildings that were really designed for urban settings in a classical language. I like to call it my small, medium, and extra large lecture. So here is an overview of the part we're going to be looking at. The little pavilion at Versailles, designed by Anjat Gabriel. Probably one of the most elegant little buildings in the world of architecture. This is French neoclassicism. So this is after the Baroque era. So we're leaving Baroque and going back into original classicism. Place de la Concorde. We'll talk about the language of the facades, how it relates to early classical architecture. A larger building, Penn Station. I'm sure you've probably seen this magnificent project that was demolished by 1960s for some horrible 50s and 60s aluminum sheet metal junk, which I'm referring to. But anyway, a far cry worse than the original building. Of course, Madison Square Garden, a magnificent building by McKinney White. Then, of course, another one, the enormous Manhattan Municipal Building. We're going to talk about the proportional relationships, the scale and the size and some of the history to this and how we how McKean and White actually arrived at these design decisions. Again, we've seen the golden section rectangle in proportion. You take the square, subdivide the midpoint, and of course the arc from the compass determines the entire rectangle. Let's look at this carefully. Pretty much every classical order is in the same vein. I'm gonna, if you guys can see my drawing table, I'm gonna graphically display what I'm talking about. If you can see on the far left, it says 5 parts. You know, we've seen that in proportion in the classical orders is that the height of the columns are determined by which order. Tuscan has 7 diameters tall. Doric, Ionic has 8. Corinthian has 10. But let's take a look at the 5 parts. And if you can you see my drawing table for the most part?
Yes.
Okay. So we have the height of the building, right? Any sort of building, we have the elevation. How do you start designing the classical orders? What you do is divide in equal parts, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 5 parts. The first part is the height of course, the entablature, which combines the architrave. I think there might be some background. Turn your microphone off, that would be great. Yeah, can we turn our microphones off? Okay, thank you. So again, you know, divide the elevation into 5 parts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The first part, of course, is the cornice, the frieze, the entablature. And after the end of the lecture, I'll give you some time to catch us. I just want to kind of briefly look over this frieze, the cornice, the frieze, and of course the architrave. So then what you would do is you would take and subdivide the column into, if you say if it's the Tuscan order, you would divide that into 7 columns tall, diameters tall. 4, 5, 6. You would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 columns. So in other words, if you have the facade, you would divide it into 5 parts. The first part is the entire entablature. Then whatever order, you would subdivide this line into 7, 8, or 10 equal spaces to determine the height of the columns. So let's remember that when we talk about the larger scale of buildings. I'm not expecting you to draw this in discussion. We can do this after the lecture. But that's really how pretty much all the orders are determined. Okay, so we're going to talk about themes and variations. These are smaller parts that will add up to a larger whole when we talk about the composition of each one of the buildings throughout the lecture. So the Diocletian window is really derived from, this is a very ancient motif from the 1st century AD, really the arched composition with the 3-part types of the windows in between it. We're borrowing this from the ancient baths of Diocletian in the 1st century AD. You can see that the structural arches are subdivided into 3, are in a tripartite scheme, the 3 bays. These are large windows, probably filled with mica or maybe some primitive form of glass. But this is a main important theme that reoccurs in classical and neoclassical architecture. So it really comes from the baths of Diocletian, Diocletian's ancient bath in the 1st century AD. You know, we see this theme picked up. Of course, here's a reconstruction of the size of the baths, or just enormous buildings. But of course, the window is a very symbolic piece that's subdivided into 3 parts. Here's a reconstruction drawing of the scale. You can see the bathers, and of course the scale we're using. Since a lot of the ancient baths are the grandest, largest proportion, we're using the largest order, composite and Corinthian. So in a large scale building, you would not see Tuscan or Ionic. You would see the grandest order, of course, the Corinthian or possibly the composite order. So again, Palladio is borrowing or sort of restyling the Diocletian window in the facade of his Villa Foscari outside of Venice. You can see the semi-arched window above expresses the barrel vaults in the section behind that. So pretty much it's a curved arch, of course it's curved, but a semi-circular arch subdivided into 3 parts. And what I was saying earlier in the lecture last week is that the barrel vault in the inside expresses the nature of the space on the facade. This is one of the first buildings in architecture really to show the cross-section registered on the facade as the Dictation window. So it's interesting that the entire barrel vault is expressed as a layer of the Dictation window on the facade. So of course, Plato is a Renaissance architect, 1560. We see it again. The Serlian arch, of course, we're going to see this later repeated again in the King White's language. Of course, we've seen this before. It's the large curved bay in the center and the two rectangular sidelights. We've seen in the diagrams last week, you can sort of analyze this in terms of the golden section ratio, which is layered over on top of this particular arch. Again, Plato is repeating the Serlian arch in his language of the facades for Basilica Vicenza, the large central bay with the arch, and of course the side flanking smaller bays on the left and the right side. We see it in Washington's Mount Vernon, of course, the same Palladian or Serlian arch, the same ratio of the large central panel with the arch, of course, the two smaller side flanking windows. So let's take a look at the building in particular, the Petit Train, the small pavilion outside of Versailles. If you analyze this in terms of geometrical relationships, there's probably a layer of golden section ratios going on in the facade. Here's a plan, a relatively small, modest building. There's nothing that crazily complex about the geometry. We talk about the regulating line. We've seen before that the regulating line regulates proportional relationships. The main diagonal in the central pavilion, which projects, you take the diagonal from the top of the columns to the very base of the columns, you can see the same angle is repeated 90 degrees, which determines a proportion for the recessed pavilions on the left and the right side. So it looks like they rotated the small in pavilions on the left and right and made that the same proportional relationship as the main central panel. So when we mix the golden section and the regulating line in the facade, you can see that there's probably a golden section relationship on the facade that overlaps the proportion. You can see that A is, of course, the square. If you subdivide the square as a midpoint, you take the compass from the midpoint to the corner. The curve from the compass determines the golden section rectangle. And let me know if I'm going too fast on these. I'm not expecting people to sketch these. I'm just kind of showing these as just examples for observation. But you can see that what's beautiful about this facade is that all the parts of rectangles are relative to each other in terms of their proportional relationships. So obviously the diagonal of the entire golden section here is turned 90 degrees and determines the angle of the window openings. So it looks like the architect just wanted these beautiful rectangles, but of course they're beautiful because they are relative to the golden section ratio. So pretty much every opening is relative to the golden section. It's really fascinating that an architect can sort of create a proportional relationship with just a few lines and diagonals. Again, the worst thing to do your facades, I think a modern architect, Louis Kahn said it, is to make all of your facades, when you're designing facades, to make them all the same. They're similar in terms of proportion and details, but however, they're very different because the main interior facade has the columns as completely freestanding Corinthian capitals and columns. You can see it's like a wonderful shadow with the columns projected out from the wall. So the side pavilions, there are engaged pilasters. So they look like they're all the same facades, but they're very different in terms of the way the columns engage the wall versus columns that project out and create a special space for each one of the columns. I just thought this was an interesting geometrical diagram, the way that all the rectangles sort of relate to each other. So again, if you can see my cursor, if you subdivide the mullions in each one of those windows, probably each one of these rectangles are again a golden section rectangle. You have to just graphically analyze that. Unfortunately, the slide is relatively blurry. A lot of people think that, my students think that a building is above ground. But of course, when you look at cross sections, look how wonderful the underground spatial conditions are. The masonry, the foundations are heavier to support the load of the building above this. You can see the front of this relatively blurry slide shows the Corinthian capital is pulled away from the wall, of course, of the main facade. There's some interesting spatial and structural relationships going on in this section. Of course, particularly the light coming in from the basement units, from the above ground. You can see the thickness of the floors is different relative to the basement, and of course, the floors above ground. Okay, so let's take a look at a larger building. This is Place de la Concorde in Paris by the same architect, Jean Gabriel, who was really Louis XV's principal architect. He did small buildings, of course, larger urban plans. So really what Jean Gabriel did was he took the mixture of Roman and Greek classicism into one beautiful composition. So the ground floor is a Roman colonnade superimposed with the Greek pavilions on the side, interlocked with the long Corinthian capital colonnade. So again, these are monumental scale buildings. The hierarchy is that since it's a large public building, we're using Corinthian capitals as a level of the most elaborate, most important order. So you will really not see Tuscan or Doric columns because, of course, this is a much larger urban scale building. So what yields the Corinthian order is the largest, the most elaborate, and the most important order next to the composite order. So we're going to see this language of Roman and, of course, the Greek pavilions on the left and right side later in McKimbing's white work, later in the lecture. So, of course, here is a very large urban plan with the pavilions that are flanking the center of the colonnade space. So pretty much, what's Andre Gabriel, he took the Roman colonnade on the right and mixed the Greek temple front as a composition for the main facade of this. We'll see this again in Penn Station and McKimbing White. Of course, if you were to graphically analyze these, you would probably see several overlapping golden sections in the creation of the main facade. Pretty much the same sort of geometrical relationship that we saw in the Petite Triana and Versailles earlier. Again, pretty much the same order every order has the architrave, the frieze, and of course the cornice. It's based on the height or the dimension, the number of diameters for each one of the columnar orders. Let's take a look at a much larger urban project, Penn Station, New York. Wonderful neoclassical architects, McKimbing White. Stanford White was really the star of the show. These are his very important, prominent partners. So pretty much what neoclassical architects are doing is they're modeling the project after ancient models, the Basso Caracalla, the Palace of Diocletian, and of course, Place de la Concorde. They're mixing the earlier language of architecture into a neoclassical composition. They're beautifully combining all these wonderful themes and variations into one composition. Unfortunately, this was demolished in the 1960s. I think Jackie Onassis had a campaign to pretty much to try to save the building, which was unsuccessful. We have this really dreadful 50s and 60s aluminum siding monster of a building, which could have been saved as a beautiful testament to classical architecture. So I'm going to show you. This, of course, is Penn Station, which demolished, the Pennsylvania Station in New York City. We can see that, the architect is modeling after what we saw Place de la Concorde, the Greek temple fronts and the projected pavilions from left to right, and of course the colonnade that links the two pavilions together. Then, of course, superimposed with the language of the three arches and the gables from the Basso Caracalla. So let's take a look at the model. Here is the scale and a model of the Basso Caracalla. These baths were enormous in the city of Rome and urban fabric. This is probably 4 or 5 football fields in scale. This is a gigantic building. The same thing with, of course, the scale and the proportion of Pennsylvania Station. So we can clearly see that they're taking the elements and themes from the ancient baths and incorporate this into a beautiful, classical building. And I think Carlos Scarpa, the modern architect, said that architects are the best thieves. They steal and borrow things from other architects. Of course, they're not really committing plagiarism. They still have to draw, imagine, and properly scale these things in each one of their projects. I thought that was just kind of an interesting quote that, architects are the best thieves in terms of aesthetics and composition. Of course, they're, varying the themes based on the scale and proportion. But again, let's take a look at the ancient baths. We can see this is Reconstruction. We see the three schemes here with the superimposed with the three gables, and of course barring the baths of Diocletian with the three partite scheme and the semicircular arch for the windows. There's a reconstruction of the baths we've seen earlier. Notice the scale and the proportion of these giant columns. Of course, probably the Corinthian and possibly the composite order. Again, this is a reconstruction drawing of the baths of Caracalla, which is a model for Penn Station. Here's Penn Station, all carved out of probably stone and marble. And what a shame for this to be demolished for modern, sensibilities. It looks just like you're walking into the baths of Caracalla. They pretty much took the perfect paradigm, an enormous scale building for the ancient baths as a large paradigm for a large urban train station. You can imagine arriving in a small train and entering this enormous space. This is definitely a far cry, I think, better in terms of scale and proportion than Grand Central Station. But of course, they're borrowing the ancient Dictation Window and the baths of Caracalla into a large urban complex. But the scale of this building is unbelievable. What I was saying earlier is really the difference between Greek structure and orders and Roman orders is that the Roman orders were technically decorative, but in this condition, the classical orders are structural. They're supporting the groin vaults above that. So this is a case where in Roman and neoclassical architecture, the columns are definitely structural. We saw in Greek architecture that the Greek columns are structural, Roman columns are decorative. But in this case, these columns are definitely the structure, holding up, of course, this enormous groined barrel vault. What's interesting is they're using the Doric order for the main colonnade. Of course, the larger Corinthian order is for the interior spaces. A little bit different than what Jean-Jacques Gabriel did. He's using only Corinthian orders. It's interesting how the two scales kind of relate to each other using different orders. Here's another detail of the building. You can see the scale of the building with, of course, the other buildings around surrounding Manhattan. Here's a wonderful model of the interior space of the Penn Station. Now, in classical architecture in the first century, these would all be cast in place concrete. I think this is possibly cut stone. It might be concrete. But of course, in neoclassical architecture, there is a steel frame behind this. So in classical architecture first century, these would all be cast in place concrete. So this is probably concrete and stone clad over a steel frame. Here's a large plan. This is the main colonnade facade. This is the main station. What you see is on the end of this, they're using an incredible steel and glass frame for parts of the terminuses. I'm sorry, the termini. So in this one, they're deviating from the ancient language of stone and masonry. They're actually using a modern sensibility in steel and iron. Of course, you're using ancient classical geometric and proportional relationships for pretty much the design for the plan, and of course, all the facades. So before we look at the other buildings, there's some other themes and variation we look at. It's called the dome, drum, and pavilion relationship. Let's go back to this is Italian architecture. This is roughly the Baroque era. The church is really designed by Borromini. The dome and the drum is really designed by Carlo Rinaldi in the 17th. So what we're looking at is a language of the cylindrical proportion, of course, with the projecting pavilions that probably articulates the buttresses for the structure. And what I mean is that, let's take a look at the language of the parts of the dome. The spherical dome sits, of course, on what's called a drum. We've seen earlier in a few slides, of course, we're incorporating buttresses on the facade for structural reasons, of course, for decorative reasons. So Carlo Rinaldi is using, and Borromini is using the Corinthian order because this is a very enormous scale of a building. So the projected pavilions are, of course, projected as the buttresses that have the Corinthian and composite order. We're going to see this again in the detail of the towers in Madison Square Garden and, of course, the Manhattan Building by McKinney. Now, remember these images. These are just wonderfully curvilinear and elliptical, playful language of spheres and cylindricals decorated with the Corinthian and composite orders. So let's take a look at Madison Square Garden, 1890, of course, designed by McKinney White. There were just phenomenal architects that really elaborated on the classical English architecture. So here's the main building block, as of course a large rectangle. Possibly, if you were to analyze this in plan, would have probably created a golden section. But let's take a look at the. It's a very Italianate building because we're actually using the Italian language of drums and domes, which we've seen in Piazza Navona in St. Ignacy, designed by Borromini and Carlo Rinaldi. You can see the towers are loosely based on the Baroque language of domes and drums. A beautiful little playful language of. It's interesting that the column on the ground has an Italian loggia. Really unusual for a building in Manhattan, New York to be completely covered by the building. You can see that each one of the bays is flanked and terminated by these exquisite little domes. Look at that in detail in just a minute. Here's a detail of the roof lines, but look at the playful and creative language that McKinney White creates for one little timpietto. The timpietto is a small little dome. If you look at the colonnade, we're using Greek onic columns. If you remember in architecture, let's look at my drawing board for a minute. The main difference between Greek columns and Roman columns is, of course, the way that the Ionic capitals are detailed. So let's take a look at the Greek Ionic. Can you see my drawing table? The Greek volutes are much larger and pronounced. The swag between the two volutes are curved. That is Greek Ionic. Roman Ionic, of course, the volutes are smaller, more carefully proportioned. The link is flat. It's interesting that one detail distinguishes hundreds of years of architecture just by the fact that the swag is flat in Roman Ionic. And of course, Greek Ionic. So McKinney White is mixing different levels of classicism, Greek Ionic, the colonnade, Baroque, and classical with, of course, the Corinthian capitals and just the flanking towers. This is just one part of the building. Unfortunately, this is a demolition scene. It was demolished 3 or 4 years before Prohibition. This was demolished in 1926 for some horrible monstrosity that we see today. But this is just one detail. Again, let's take a look at the building. Just a magnificent interplay of Italian Baroque and classical themes, especially the tower, which we'll see in just a minute. So we have on the facade 2 registers. The colonnade for the urban condition, you can walk covered by the building. Then, of course, we can see the sky in the upper colonnade. So the facade incorporates the sky and the ground plane in one facade. You can see there's 2 loggias, the upper loggia, of course, the ground floor loggia. Unfortunately, we only have black and white photographs because we're only seeing the building photographed in black and white between the years of 1890 and 1926. So again, the tower is proportioned for the scale of the city, not for the entire building. The pavilions with the domes are designed for the scale of the block that houses the entire perimeter of the building. There's 2 different scales going on: the scale of the building facade and the scale of the tower for the entire city. 2 relatively different, but beautifully articulated and proportioned. This, of course, stands for White's enormous sort of beard and mustache. Interesting sort of biography. Sanford was just obsessed with architecture. He was staying up all night drawing and would he would design gowns and parties and all these incredible elaborate receptions. He was probably an early sort of manic person because he really didn't sleep at all. He drank a lot, drew a lot, created these incredible projects, had affairs with wives, socialized with celebrities, only to be shot by the famous Gibson Girl's husband, Evelyn Nesbit. He was a totally insane husband, had an affair with a Gibson girl, glorified by this famous artist that you've seen her face drawn and immortalized in drawings, probably different sort of themes and plates and dishes. The story is when he was 52 years old, he was at a reception in the Madison Square Garden, was shot by Evelyn Nesbit, the Gibson girl's husband. And so that was a story. He died 52 years of age, being murdered by her husband, but he had left an incredible legacy of incredible projects and buildings. I thought that was an interesting story about some of the lives of one of these famous, incredibly neo-classical. Aside from that, let's take a look at a particular building and statue atop of Madison Square Garden. Her name is Diana of the Tower. The sculptor was Augusta St. Gaudens. The goddess Diana becomes a symbol and the icon for the symbol of the Institute of Classical Architecture. So here's Diana atop of what used to be the top of the corner, the main tower in Madison Square Garden. And Valerie, I'm not sure where the sculpture is. I'm assuming it's in a museum. Do you have any insights where the sculpture is? I'm not sure if Valerie is there, but anyway, so this is really the symbol that's for the ICAA, the Institute of Classical Architecture, which is borrowed from the sculpture at the very, very top of Madison Square Garden. Let's take a look at the nomenclature of the tower itself. So we're seeing different themes that are borrowed from earlier precedents or paradigms. We can see the Cerulean arch in the main body of before the cupola of the base, the Cerulean arch. We see the towers, of course, is the same language as the cathedral in San Ignace, and of course, in Italian Rome. And of course, we're seeing the colonnade around the base, the very playful and imaginative language of architecture and just the tower itself. But it's interesting that this building is probably 600 feet in the air and she's barely even touching the two spheres. It's remarkable that building that she's actually up there for as long as it was. Okay, so that's Madison Square Garden. We're going to be looking at another McKinley White building. It's designed by an architect in the office. And let's make sure that your microphones are turned off because I still hear a lot of background noise. So let's take a look at the Manhattan Beast. Again, it's designed by McKinley White, by a specific architect in the office, 1909, 1914. This is just huge scale. This building is 600 feet above ground. Here is a photograph under construction. Fortunately, the building is still there. It has not been demolished. But let's take a look at the language of classical architecture. Of course, you know, there's a steel frame behind this, and of course, there is the stone cladding around it as a decorative skin. So let's take up the geometry of the facade. It's really a large square, superimposed with different geometrical relationships. I superimposed the golden section as probably the main proportioning system for the main body of the building. It looks like the building is designed as a large classical column. So isn't this the large shaft for the main body, the base of the Capitol, and of course the top is the cornice? So we talk about the language. Let me go back to this. Let's take a look at the central tower at the very top of the building. The classical order is so large that instead of triglyphs and metopes, there are windows between the triglyphs. The windows are actually the metopes. The scale of the frieze is so large that there's an occupiable floor in this. This is just an enormously scaled and proportioned building. Here's a wonderful playful language of the tower, loosely based on some of the geometry, the proportion we've seen in some of the domes. And again, it's a little bit more of a derivation of the tower that we've seen in the Madison Square Garden building. You can clearly see these are designed by the same architecture firm. So the tower is just an extraordinary piece of architecture in itself, aside from just the main proportions of the body of the building itself. So let's take a look at the plan geometry. This is really interesting because the plan of this building, actually, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner, resolves the alignment in the center of the two streets. What's interesting is that, hold on a minute, I'm losing my, just a second.
Oh, so he needs to mute. Yeah.
So the plan of the building is actually a parallelogram. Can you believe, not only is it difficult to design a building just with 90-degree angles, is the fact that these are all parallelogrammatic relationships. Everything is skewed. Even the tower is not a right triangle. It's completely, they're all elliptical columns and parallelograms. Really remarkable and a little bit crazy to think that somebody was going to draw and design and build these things in a relationship. I'm not sure why they went as far as building every floor plate as a parallelogram, but it is an interesting geometrical relationship, especially the plans of each one of the towers. Very difficult to design and build and construct. So again, we can see the playful language of the columns and the domes are loosely based on the church in St. Ignatius in Rome, Italy, by Rinaldi. So I'm showing you is in the lecture a range of large, enormous scale buildings using a similar classical language of architecture in large scale buildings, medium scale buildings, and of course, small scale buildings in a small pavilion we saw earlier at the beginning of the lecture. So on my drawing table, what I'm going to show you is the proportion of this building designed as a large columnar order itself. So if you can see, so to remember, let's talk about the 1:5 ratio. We saw that if you take the elevation of the height, 2, 3, I'm just eyeballing, you can divide this into 5 parts. The first part, of course, is the entablature. But if I sketch the facade of the Manhattan Municipal Building, we can see that we divide the main facade into 5 parts: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the top is the entire cornice, the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. So could the rest of the building be just a large column? Then, of course, the entire base on the facade is one large proportional base. So the architects are using the same proportional relationship from this diagram you've seen earlier into the design of the entire facade and the building itself. A very simple way to proportion an entire monumental facade using the simple relationship of one part as relative to a larger whole. That's exactly what they did. It looks very intimidating to scale. This building is huge. Look how tall. The columns are 3 or 4 stories on the columnar band above that. But this is just an extraordinary and beautiful example of the way you can use a smaller classical building and use the same proportioning system for a larger scale building. You know, again, the 4th register on the drawing table is really the large Corinthian columns at the very top of the building. Then, of course, the tower has its own layering based on some of the domes we just saw earlier in the lecture. So the entire proportioning lecture is taking a small diagram we've seen earlier in smaller buildings and increasing the scale using the same proportional system. This golden section rectangle could be any size, any proportion. It's relative to any sort of scale, proportion, any size of the building. So if you look at the earlier lecture, we've taken some very simple themes and variations, the Dictation Window, the Versailles arch, the Palladian window, and mixing them into a much larger composition. I just think this is fascinating, a little bit insane to build an entire building with all parallelogrammatic spaces. There's really no 90 degree. There are a few 90-degree corners, but even how could you? It's strange that you would even think you would perceive this as an elliptical body, but of course in plan it isn't. And Stanford White's firm, they were just really insane and obsessed about geometry and architecture. You can tell they were extremely passionate about their work. Ambition and passion, comes into play in creating these extraordinary buildings. Okay, we have about 20 minutes. Just let me know if you want me to go back and stop on a slide to include in your sketchbook or your notebook. These are a list of the buildings that we just saw with some themes and details. And we can entertain some questions.
Could we look at the parts of a dome again?
Yeah, of course. I'm going to flip back to this slide for just a minute. Really the difference between Gothic and Renaissance architecture is because Renaissance architecture would not allow, it would be terribly unacceptable to show physical buttresses. So when Brunelleschi designed the Florentine cathedral, he concealed all the structure inside the body of the dome. You would not express the buttresses. But I think in this case, there's some exception because the weight of the dome was so great that I think Carlo Rinaldi expressed the buttresses as these decorative columns. They're probably not decorative, they are adding structure for the weight of the dome. It's interesting the way that they try to cover up the fact that you're not really not supposed to be showing buttresses in Renaissance architecture, which would be considered vulgar, but beautifully disguised in details. If you look at the Dome of St. Peter's, or I'm sorry, St. Paul's in London, Christopher Wren does the same thing. He expresses the buttress as decorative elements and disguises them as the structure. And then I can go back and leave this one up if you want. Of course, everyone should have a copy of the PowerPoint, so I can email this to you.
Sorry, back on the dome.
Yes.
Where you say projected pavilions, what is that referring to?
Yes. Well, what I'm saying, pavilions, is that the buttresses are wide enough to where they create a small projected body. I'm just loosely terming. I'm just
I see.
calling that as a pavilion.
Okay.
Because really, a pavilion, in a larger sense of that word, is the ones that project. We've seen in the front of Penn Station where the Greek pavilions project as a projected pavilion itself.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just as an architect, it's heartbreaking to see that these, especially something like this, is been demolished. Of course, due to the fact that in the 50s and 60s they were getting away from classical architecture, and so they pretty much are trying to streamline everything and make everything as modern as possible. But to go and rebuild something like this today would be Herculean task even to do that.
Jay, could you talk for a minute about the use of the architrave in situations where an arch comes down on top, like in the Bats or like Madison Square Garden, or, that picture's great. Where you don't have any relationship, I've always seen the architrave as being a beam.
Yeah.
And in a situation where you don't have that completely expressed, why would you use the architrave in that situation and not just carry the column up to the arch like you see in a colonnade?
Well, because again, you would always show any columnar order, even if it's just a projected piece or fragment, as this relationship. So in other words, you would never, ever have the cornice just leave out the main parts. I think to answer your question is, why did they do that? Because hold on a minute. Let me go back to this animation. Because look how it would look like a blatant mistake. You're saying, why don't they just bring the column up to the cornice?
Well, right. I mean, like you see in colonnades.
Right. Well, yeah, because, like this one, you're seeing the architrave, the frieze in every condition about the column.
Go to the Italianate building.
Oh, this one.
Oh,
Madison Square Garden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So see how you don't have an architrave above those columns at that colonnade.
That's an interesting question. I don't think, when you have just a row of arches, you probably don't need the entablature, because the arches take place of all the three parts. Let me go back to something else like.
And I guess that was my question. Why wouldn't the arch have taken the place of it in those other situations?
Exactly. Let me look at another image. Yeah, so let me, do you mind if I Google something real quick?
Can I interrupt for a second? I think Alberti wrote that you should never have an arch on top of a column, but Brunelleschi had done it at the what's that beautiful building in Florence that he did for the orphanage, the Innocente? He did it there, and people copied that, but Alberti came up with a rule that you should never have an arch on top of a column, so people tried to avoid that.
Yeah, let me see. I'm gonna look that one up. I think, is it Santa Croce, or which is the church that Brunelleschi did? And
I think it was the Ospedale Innocente.
yeah, I want to look that one up because I think that. So here's the Florence Hospital. That's a very good question. I haven't really noticed that, but let me go back to this. Okay, can you see the image on the Google page? Well, you know, this is Brunelleschi's Florentine Hospital, but you're saying Alberti says you never, what were you saying again? You never have an arch on top of a column?
Yeah, and people who emulated Brunelleschi would do it, and others would follow Alberti. It was just a rule. You don't really see arches on top of columns until the Victorian period.
That's really interesting. If you look at the facade of the church to the left of that, if you can see this.
I can't see your screen. I see your drawing, and I see the Madison Square Garden on the screen.
Okay, hold on just a moment. Okay, so you can see the screen now that has the Florentine Hospital.
Yes.
Okay, so here's an example with no entablature and just the arches on top of the column. But then if you look at the church facade on the left, there is an entablature above the columns. You can see the cornice. Let me see if I can enlarge that. Well, there again, yeah, we still see the arches on top of the column. It's interesting. That's structurally difficult to do because look how thin these columns are. They're holding up the entire weight of the second floor above that. Yeah, here we go there. Yeah, I guess let me go back to Santa Maria del Pace for just a minute.
So basically rules are made to be broken.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Well, here, you know, this of course is the superimposition of the arches with the columns as pilasters, but there's actually no entablature at all. There's just simply a spring line. That's really interesting that you can see the rules are broken. This is, you know, the cloister in Santa Maria del Pace in Rome. But yeah, that's interesting that there's parts of it where they leave out the entire entablature. Can you guys see the Google page? Yeah, I think, you know, each architect has their own sort of canon of proportion and rules. I'm not sure why that is. That's a very good question. You know, this is, of course, a magnificent facade. I was going to show this. Hold on a minute. I ran out of time to get this together, but the facade of Santa Maria della Pace, I think this might be Colorado, but the entire frieze, the entire entablature continues all the way around every corner and every part of this facade. The only time you don't see the entablature is in the cloister facade, where it's just simply the spring line. That's interesting. I'm glad you pointed that out. Well, yeah, there's some, architecture has wonderful contradictions and complexity. You can't possibly answer everything in an hour. So it's good to keep thinking and asking questions. This is actually one of the few architects that actually treats there's a special space just for the Corinthian column, if I can find the image. Anyway, we have about 5 or 10 more minutes. Do you have any other questions, or I can go back to some of the slides? Yeah, I think this.
The Madison Square Garden building that we're looking at, that was contemporary with Penn Station, right?
This is temporary.
No, I was wondering if this building and the Penn Station building that we were looking at, if they were built around the same time, were they built around the same time?
Penn Station, this was, let me go back to my time chart for a minute. Penn Station was 1910, Madison, yeah, they were roughly around the same time, yeah. Madison Square Garden came first, that was 1890. Penn Station was about 10 or 20 years later.
And they're both gone, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, they are both gone. If you look up what the Penn Station building is now, it's just a dreadful sort of metal cylinder. It's mostly just programmed and no soul and no architecture. For somebody to come on to take this thing down for that. I mean, this is probably one of our best, most successful ancient Roman baths reconstruction in person we could have seen before 1960. But look at that. And also, I think the demolition, it was so well built that the demolition crew went bankrupt.
Wow.
Because this is such a monumental, magnificent building that was so difficult to demolish. It's kind of the same story about a lot of early Frank Lloyd Wright's masonry buildings, is that there were so many masonry and steel layers, it was really difficult to demolish.
Yeah, it's a shame.
Yeah. Especially something as wonderfully playful and imaginative. Of course, buildings back in New York were getting much larger and bigger and bigger. I don't think the amphitheater was even allowed. It was getting too small to accommodate all of the spectators. But if architects have a certain amount of imagination, they could at least kept some parts of the wall. My students at UT are doing a project in Venice. They want to just tear all the buildings down and do a new modern one. I said, if you're truly a modernist architect, you would remember the past and build for the future. You can incorporate some existing fragments into the modern building. They could have done this. But, this is a time where they didn't have historical landmark preservation societies. They were getting away from classical styles. So this was just considered outdated and completely last season. Luckily, this building still exists. That would be such a travesty to demolish something as extraordinary as this, or a steel and glass skyscraper.
I was wondering if you could identify one of the slides that you have. It's a color photograph, and there's two buildings on either side, and in the center there's a sort of a building in the distance that has a triangular pediment. I missed. Yes, there it is. I missed what is that building?
Now this is Place de la Concorde by Gabriel. I think this is probably, I can't remember the name of that Greek temple.
The Madeleine.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, I have a habit of not labeling every slide. Yeah.
The Madeleine. Madeleine.
Madeleine.
Yes. Okay.
Was built by Napoleon, then converted to a church. It's more in the Greek style, I think, or
yes, it's definitely Greek.
It's right, roughly 1820s, 1830s, when it was finally finished.
Right.
Okay. And that's located in Rome? Where is that located?
No, this is in Paris.
Paris.
Because Antoine Gabriel pretty much did all buildings in Paris. He didn't do anything in Rome. So this is wonderful large outdoor piazza or place in French is it's a large piazza in Paris. So. And I thought I had a site plan of this, but I don't. It's Place de la Concorde in Paris. So pretty much Antoine Gabriel, which the Gabriel Award Foundation awards one person every summer, is that he's really Louis XV's architect. He designed most of his buildings, a lot of the buildings on Versailles. I just thought this plan was really surprising about the language of getting away from the 90-degree relationship. You would think that would make it easier by the time you get up to the top floor, that the tower would just be perceived as round and not, skewed and elliptical. I think we're right at 1 o'clock. Does anyone have any other questions, or do I need to go back to one of the slides?
Are there any example that you know of a building that replicates the Roman bath feel? Like Penn Station was obviously one of them, but it's gone. Is there any other building that does that?
In terms of, I can't really even think of one right off the top of my head, because they are so large and so expensive to even build in that sort of idiom. The only one I think of is really the Penn Station. The thing about, let me show this to you. The Baths of Diocletian, I'll show this brief in a minute. The other one that actually exists is really, this is the ancient Baths of Diocletian. Michelangelo, during the Renaissance, remodeled the nave into another church. So you can still have the scale and the detail of what the original baths used to look like as a lobby.
Could you share your screen, please?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so here is, can you see this? This, of course, is the enormous Baths of Diocletian. What Michelangelo did was he remodeled the interior of parts of the bath where the columbarium is, and remodeled that into a Renaissance church. This is just extraordinary work that Michelangelo, you can see the labor and all the details for that. So you can still see the scale and what one of the parts of the ancient baths used to look like. So Michelangelo kind of remodeled it with his own language of classical architecture, but still kept intact of what the columnar orders probably used to look like in that scene in the 1st century AD. What you're looking at is kind of a contradiction, because in the beginning of my lecture several months ago, I talked about the fact that the composite order, which is a mixture of Ionic and Corinthian, wasn't introduced until the Renaissance. But really, if you look at Reconstruction drawings of some of these ancient baths, is that they probably did have the composite order. So I'm not really sure if the Renaissance edition of the composite order is actually true. That's somewhat speculative. But you can still see the scale and magnitude of parts of the ancient baths, what it used to look like. I mean, Penn Station looks just like, the Baths of Caracalla, not really Diocletian, but so here's the part that Michelangelo remodeled. So again, during classical history, they would remove stone and marble to make other buildings as a just kind of at the risk of sacrificing the integrity of other buildings. This is the detail of parts of the walls of the basement. You can see that they removed a lot of the marble in the classical orders to make other buildings. We're seeing the structure of the masonry on the outside of it. So pretty much these all were covered with marble and porphyry stone as an elaborate sort of entablature combination. But of course, that's all been removed. Here's a plan of one of its. The size of the perimeter is probably 4 or 5 football fields large. These are enormous buildings. Anyway, well, to close out the lecture, I just thought this was interesting to see you can take some very small things and repeat them at a much larger scale and use the same sort of proportion system for a smaller building and to much larger ones. You know, especially something to this magnitude and scale. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I think this will end our lecture. I'm having another one on proportion again next Tuesday. I'm looking forward to seeing everybody on Tuesday. I think we'll do some short drawing exercises in class on Tuesday. So I want to make sure you bring a sketchbook, a scale, a triangle, and some pencils. Any other last minute questions?
Thank you all so much. We appreciate you coming.
Okay, thanks again, Valerie.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.